A barge sits off the coast of Florida, and on board, a large water cannon blasts mounds of shell overboard, aiming carefully at a specific patch of seafloor marked out ahead of time. There's nothing glamorous about the process itself, just truckloads of old, broken oyster shells being shoveled, piled, barged out, and shot into the water in precise locations. But what happens next, over the following months and years, is the part that genuinely surprises people who see it for the first time. The bare, lifeless seafloor doesn't stay bare. It starts growing. Florida's coastal restoration agencies, working alongside conservation groups and federal partners, have spent the past 2 decades placing massive quantities of shell into Gulf and estuarine waters specifically to rebuild oyster reefs that disease. Pollution, storms, and decades of overharvesting wiped out. The most recent headline-grabbing figure puts the cumulative total at roughly 500,000 tons of shell placed offshore across these combined efforts. That's not one single dump in one single location. It's the sum of dozens of individual projects spread across estuaries and bays from the Panhandle down through southwest Florida, each one targeting a specific stretch of degraded seafloor that used to be a thriving reef before human activity tore it apart. To understand why this works, you have to understand exactly what an oyster needs to survive in the first place, because the entire restoration strategy hinges on one very specific biological fact. Baby oysters, known as larvae, drift freely through the water for the first couple of weeks of their lives. At some point, each larva needs to find a hard surface to attach itself to permanently, because once it settles, it's there for life, the ideal surface. By a wide margin is existing oyster shell. Once a larva finds that hard calcium carbonate surface and attaches, it's called spat, and from that moment forward, it begins growing into an adult oyster, cementing itself into place and eventually becoming part of the very structure that future generations of larvae will land on. That's the whole mechanism in a nutshell. Shell attracts spot E. Spat grows into oysters. Oysters create more shell, and the reef builds itself, layer by layer, generation by generation. That's also exactly why simply leaving a degraded reef alone doesn't fix it. Without a hard surface for new larvae to land on, there's nowhere for the next generation to take hold, even if adult oysters nearby are spawning successfully. Researchers describe available shell as one of the single biggest limiting factors in oyster reef. Recovery anywhere in the country, you can have plenty of larvae in the water and plenty of healthy water conditions, but if there's nothing solid on the seafloor for those larvae to grab onto, the population simply can't rebuild itself. That's the entire logic behind dumping shell back into these waters in such enormous quantities. It's not decoration. It's literally rebuilding the foundation the species needs in order to reproduce at scale again. The scope of what's actually been lost makes this restoration effort feel less like an experiment and more like an emergency response, according to NOAA Fisheries, overharvesting, Human-caused disasters like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and sedimentation from increasingly powerful storms have reduced historic oyster populations across the Gulf Coast by 85% or more. Florida's own Department of Environmental Protection has documented similarly devastating local collapses in the Pensacola Bay system specifically. More than 90% of commercially harvestable oysters died off in 1971 alone, the result of disease driven by years of industrial and residential pollution dumped directly into the bay. Down in southwest Florida, researchers with the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation found that roughly 90% of the oyster reefs near a site called Shell Point, once one of the most productive reef areas in the region, were destroyed by a combination of road construction projects and the compounding effects of droughts and floods globally and regionally. Oyster populations are estimated to have declined by around 90% compared to a century ago. These aren't small, isolated losses. This is one of the most dramatic ecological collapses of any species along the American coastline, and it happened largely out of public view, underwater, over the course of decades. So where does the shell for all this rebuilding actually come from? There are 2 main sources, and both are worth understanding because they reveal just how resourceful this entire effort has had to become. The first is recycled shell, collected directly from restaurants and seafood processors. And OAA partners with 5 separate oyster shell recycling programs across the Gulf, which together have recycled millions of tons of shell that would otherwise have ended up in a landfill after a meal. In Alabama, one recycling partnership working with a single restaurant chain has recovered more than 2 million individual shells since 2016 alone. Florida's own DEP has run a similar program out of Pensacola since 2011, partnering with local nonprofits to collect discarded shell from area restaurants specifically to use as hard substrate for new reef construction. The second source is stranger and in its own way more remarkable, ancient, fossilized shell mined directly out of the ground. In southwest Florida, a recent reef restoration project at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River used roughly 6 million pounds. Just over 3,000 tons of shell sourced from a mine near Babcock Ranch in Charlotte County. These aren't recently discarded restaurant shells. They're shells that are tens of thousands of years old, buried deep underground from a time when Florida's coastline sat in an entirely different place than it does today, as the coastline has shifted back and forth over geological time. Each ancient bay bottom got buried under a new layer of sand, then covered by another bay, repeating over and over across thousands of years, leaving Florida's interior riddled with fossilized shell deposits dozens of miles from the current shoreline and, in some places, nearly 100 miles from where the coast used to sit. Companies mining these deposits typically use the smaller fossil shells for driveways and landscaping material, the larger, heavier shells. The ones too big for that commercial use turn out to be ideal for reef restoration, specifically because their extra weight helps them stay anchored to the seafloor during hurricanes, when smaller or lighter material would simply get swept away. Once the shell actually hits the water, the timeline of what happens next follows a remarkably consistent pattern, one that's been documented closely enough by marine ecologists that it's now considered well-established restoration science rather than guesswork. Within a short period after placement, microscopic organisms begin colonizing the rough surface of the shells. Bacteria and algae form what's called a biofilm, a thin living layer that coats the shell and subtly changes the surrounding water chemistry in ways that specifically attract the larvae of multiple marine species. That biofilm stage is critical because it essentially signals to drifting larvae that this particular patch of seafloor is now a viable place to settle. Soon after, small invertebrates start attaching directly to the shells. Barnacles, tube worms, and the first wave of juvenile oysters. From there, the reef starts reinforcing itself in a genuine feedback loop. Oysters are extraordinarily efficient filter feeders. A single adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in just 24 hours, pulling in algae, bacteria, suspended sediment, and even chemical contaminants as it feeds. As more oysters establish themselves and start filtering, the surrounding water gets measurably clearer. That improved clarity lets more sunlight reach the seafloor nearby, which in turn encourages seagrass growth in adjacent areas, meaning a successful oyster reef doesn't just rebuild itself, it actively improves the health of the ecosystem around it. The growth doesn't stop at the original footprint of placed shell either. As oyster generations continue settling and building on top of each other, the reef begins growing vertically, layer stacking on layer, much the way coral reefs build height over time. Larvae also settle beyond the boundaries of the original shell field as the reef matures, gradually expanding the footprint of usable habitat well past where the restoration crews originally placed material. Within the first year, researchers tracking these sites have documented significant increases in overall biodiversity. Small crustaceans like amphipods and worms establish a foundational food web almost immediately, which then draws in small fish hunting for prey, which in turn eventually attracts larger predatory fish once that prey base stabilizes. Blue crabs benefit too, using the reef's crevices and structure as shelter that measurably increases their survival rates. By the time a reef matures, it functions as a self-sustaining habitat for an entire community of species, not just the oysters that originally anchored it. There's also a coastal protection benefit to all of this that goes well beyond habitat and water quality, and it's a big part of why state and federal agencies have been willing to fund these projects at this scale. Oyster reefs physically reduce W Avenue energy as it moves toward shore, acting as a natural breakwater, research conducted. In the Gulf of Mexico has found that oyster reefs can reduce wave energy by anywhere from 76 to 99% depending on conditions. That matters enormously in a region where rising sea levels and increasingly intense hurricanes are eroding coastal land at a documented rate of roughly 1 football field's worth of land every 100 minutes. Every reef that gets rebuilt functions as one more buffer slowing that erosion down, protecting the shoreline, reducing storm surge intensity, and in the process, protecting the homes, infrastructure, and communities sitting just behind it. So what actually formed out of 500,000 tons of shell dumped offshore isn't some single dramatic structure rising out of the water for cameras to capture in one shot. It's something quieter and, by most measures, more impressive. Dozens of separate, maturing oyster reefs scattered across Florida's coastline, each one slowly transitioning from an artificial shell pile into something biologically indistinguishable from a wild, naturally formed reef. The Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation alone has restored roughly a dozen reefs in southwest Florida, totaling around 7 acres, with active plans to expand toward 25 acres of restored habitat in Charlotte Harbor specifically. The Florida Oceanographic Society has restored nearly 60,000 square feet of reef in the St. Lucie Estuary and Indian River Lagoon, work made possible by more than 2,400 volunteers logging over 6,000 hours alongside partnerships with 20 local restaurants donating their discarded shells. None of this means the broader oyster collapse along Florida's coast has been solved. It's also worth understanding what's actually funding all of this, because reef restoration on this scale doesn't happen through goodwill alone. A single 3-acre reef project at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River, for example, came together through roughly $210,000 in combined grants. $75,000 from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, another $75,000 from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through Florida's State Wildlife Grants Program, $51,000 from Lee County Natural Resources, and $10,000 from the Coastal Conservation Association. On a larger scale, an OAA has committed $5 million specifically to expand Gulf Coast oyster restoration efforts, funding partners working to restore populations, protect vanishing land, and reconnect coastal communities to a resource that's been central to the region. Ease economy and culture for generations, going back to indigenous communities who relied on oysters as a primary food source long before European settlement. That funding picture matters because it shows this isn't a single state agency acting alone. It's a layered coalition of federal grants, state wildlife funding, county resources, conservation nonprofits, and in some cases tribal partnerships, all converging on the same basic strategy because the underlying science keeps producing the same successful results. There's a cultural dimension to this story, too, one that goes beyond the ecology. In New Orleans, oysters have been central to the city's identity since long before anyone tracked population declines in scientific reports. The dish Oysters Rockefeller was invented there in 1889, and it's still served today in the very restaurant. Where it originated, Alabama, meanwhile, brands itself as the country's top oyster processor, a title that depends entirely on having enough live, healthy reefs to keep supplying that industry when 85% of a region's historic oyster population disappears. It's not just an ecological statistic. It threatens restaurants, seafood processors, fishing communities, and a culinary tradition that, in some Gulf Coast towns, stretches back further than the towns themselves. Restoration efforts like Florida's shell dumping program are only about rebuilding habitat for its own sake. They're explicitly framed by the people running them as an attempt to sustain an entire regional economy and way of life that depends on oysters continuing to exist in the wild at meaningful numbers. It's also worth being honest about timeline, because none of this happens quickly. Marine scientists overseeing these projects describe success in terms of years, not months, tracking recruitment rates, water depth, salinity stability, and proximity to existing oyster populations and seagrass beds before they leave and call a new reef. cite high probability for long-term survival. Salinity in particular has proven to be one of the trickiest variables to mana. G. Especially near river mouths where freshwater and saltwater mix. At the Caloosahatchee River site, researchers specifically credited new regulations governing when and how much freshwater can be released from Lake Okeechobee, with helping stabilize salinity levels enough to give the restored reef a realistic chance at long-term survival. A reminder that rebuilding a reef isn't purely a biological project. It's also tied directly to water management policy decisions made well upstream, sometimes decades earlier, that determine whether a given patch of seafloor can even support oyster life in the first place. What started as a logistics question, what do you do with 500,000 tons of leftover shell instead of sending it to a landfill, turned into one of the more effective, repeatable ecological restoration strategies currently being deployed anywhere along the American coastline. It required mining companies, restaurants, marine biologists, federal grant programs, water management agencies, and volunteer crews with water cannons, all working independently toward versions of the same goal across more than a decade. And reef by reef, acre by acre, the formula keeps working exactly the way the science predicted it would.